To this meeting is being recorded. So, good evening. Hello, Cory. This is a pre-recorded interview because you're going to be at another event during this weekend, as it will be, and you can tell us about that in a moment. But just to introduce you to everybody, this is Cory Doctorow. He's one of Canadians' probably best-known writers. He's won the John Campbell Award for Best New Writer, the Locus Award for Best First Novel for Down and Out in the Magic Kingdom, Sunburst Award, more Locust Awards, and also the one that I always really like, which is the Prometheus Award, which I've now forgotten what you won that for, but it's one of my favorite awards because it's for libertarian science fiction. And it has an unbelievably wide definition of libertarian, which means it's always an interesting
They,
award.
they keep giving it to socialists, which is very funny. Yeah.
So I thought we'd just start with a casual. How do you get into science fiction?
Well, so I grew up in Toronto and I was born in 71. And that turns out to have been the closest we have ever come at any time or place in the history of the world to having a formal apprenticeship to be a science fiction writer. And it's because of Judith Merril. So Judy, many viewers will know, was a towering critic, editor, and writer in science fiction, part of the Futurians. And she had been married to Frederick Pohl, another great figure in science fiction. And after the 1968 police riots in Chicago, a time when American politics showed its ugly authoritarian side, she decided that she couldn't live in America anymore and bring up children there in good conscience. She and Fred had recently divorced, so she brought the kids to Toronto and entered self-imposed exile. And one of the things she did was donate her books, her and Fred's books, to the Toronto Public Library System, where from the nucleus of what was then called the spaced out library, but is now called the Merrill Collection, and is the largest science fiction reference collection in the world, maintained by a public institution. I'm on its board, very proud to be on its board. And Judy got all kinds of weird gigs. So she knew my folks through radical politics. And she also had a regular gig on TV Ontario, our public broadcaster, introducing Doctor Who every week. And when my mom was at teachers college every week, my dad would make supper rather, and we'd eat dinner in front of the TV with my baby brother, and we'd watch Judy introduce Doctor Who. And for those of you who don't know Judy, she was like kind of an avatar of Slappy Squirrel, iron gray hair, a squint. She was a chain smoker. She had a raspy voice. She was from New York. She took no shit. And she would come out and she would be like, tonight's Doctor Who episode is about time loops. I remember we invented time loops at a spaghetti potluck dinner at the Futurian house in 1937. I remember that night because Isaac Asimov was there and he kept grabbing C.M. Kornbluth's girlfriend's ass. We wrote 13 stories about time loops that night. I took the A train to Rockefeller Center. I threw them over the transom of John W. Campbell. He published them in the next year, and that is where time loops come from. And so we would watch Doctor Who with Judy. And when I was about 9 years old, my school took a trip to the Spaced Out Library where she was the writer in residence. And she was like, kids, if you write a story, you can bring it to my library and I'll help you make it better. And this is to be Canadian for a minute. This is like Wayne Gretzky offering to help 10-year-olds work on their slap shot. And so I had a subway pass and I just started going down to Judy's library and asking her to critique my extremely juvenile juvenilia. Judy would put science fiction writers who were under her wing together and get them to form workshops. And eventually ended up in a workshop that's still going called the Cecil Street Irregulars. Its members over the years have included Carl Schrader, Madeline Ashby, Alan Weiss, Peter Watts, and so on. So I was in a writing workshop that Judy had taught us how to conduct on Clarion Lines. I got a job at Baca Books, which is the oldest science fiction bookstore in the world, still extant. Baca was started when Judy bullied a local fan into starting a science fiction bookstore. And so I worked at the science fiction bookstore. We had a regular science fiction writers or science fiction professionals movable feast based on the New York Hydra meetings called Toronto Hydra. And every 6 weeks or so, we'd go to a different writer or editor or critic or artist or filmmaker's house. Everyone would kick in a couple of bucks for beer and food, and we'd have this sort of schmooze fest. So I started going to those. I met everyone in the field that way in Ontario. The first magazine that ever bought one of my stories was called On Spec. This magazine, still going, from the prairies. It was started when Judy bullied a couple of local fans into starting a workshop, a magazine there. And then the first anthology I ever edited was one of the Tesseract's anthologies, a science fiction anthology series that Judy founded with this, groundbreaking Tesseract's anthology, which is now in, I don't know how many volumes, 15 or 18 volumes of Canadian science fiction. So, like, at every corner, you have Judith Merrill basically paving the way. Even I went to a weird alternative secondary school. I spent 7 years getting a 4-year diploma. One of the reasons I spent so long in my secondary school is we had an amazing writing workshop that was like a 4-credit writing workshop, and writers, teen writers from all over Toronto would travel downtown to go to this writing workshop. And I had been in that workshop for like 5 years before the English teacher who ran it, Harriet Wolfe, told me, oh, by the way, this workshop was founded by Judith Merrill 20 years ago through a Writers in the School grant, and it's still going. So, like, she created this milieu in which people who had ambitions to write science fiction or write more broadly or to be a professional in the field, we all had this thing. I ended up consulting on this TV show called Prisoners of Gravity that was started by the people who had been involved with that Doctor Who stuff that Judy had been running. Like, all of it was kind of descended from Judith Merrill. She was an incredible writer, an incredible editor, an incredible critic, but her legacy is going to be the mentorship she did and the institutions she created that outlasted her by a generation, and that created a generation of science fiction writers.
And I'll just mention for people watching that we've got interviews with Diane Walton from On Spec and Candice Jane Dorsey, who was one of the editors of Tesseract for quite a while. So yes, I mean, we
Mm-hmm.
can still see these things going on. So what's being a Canadian science fiction writer like then? How did you
Well,
feel about the Canadian community?
well, so there's a famous Canadian Broadcasting Corporation competition to finish the sentence as Canadian as, and the winning entry was possible under the circumstances. And I am as Canadian as possible under the circumstances. Like all the best Americans, I'm a Canadian. I live in Burbank, California. Um, no one is quite so Canadian as a Canadian who doesn't live in Canada. You end up very keenly aware of all the ways in which you are Canadian. I also lived in the United Kingdom for 13 years. And living in both of those countries gives you a kind of masterclass in the extent to which Canada is and is not a hybrid of America and the United Kingdom.
Yeah.
It's not just like some of column A and some of column B. There is some very weird sui generis Canadian stuff that you don't know is sui generis until you leave, and you get a sort of thorough grounding in both.
Give us
Um,
an example.
hmm. I would say that there's like aspects of, it's affective, I would say. So this joke about Canada, right, where we apologize all the time. The way you find a Canadian in an elevator is you step on everyone's foot until someone apologizes to you. Although a friend of mine always points out, he's Indigenous, that this only works if if you're not Indigenous, because if you're Indigenous, Canadians will never ever apologize to you.
Oh,
Which, you know, it's to ask me about our mass graves. There is something about this affect of Canadianness where Canadians think that when they're being deferential, that they are being cultured in a British manner, and they think that when they're being brash, that they're being brash in an American manner. And there are aspects of the deference and the brashness that are found in neither country. There's just ways in which it's it's very, like, someday I'll figure out an example of it and I'll put it in a book or something. But for now, yeah, it's just it's 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 very funny. My dad was a refugee, and his first language wasn't English; it was Yiddish. And he arrived at Canada at a time of great hostility to refugees, and experienced a lot of kind of violence and harassment and so on. And he leaned hard into assimilating, and he has a kind of low grade anxiety about pronouncing things in a Canadian way and not an American way. And some of the things that he thinks are Canadian pronunciation or American pronunciations are not American pronunciations. They're just variant Canadian pronunciations that some Canadians consider to be American. It's a very odd anxiety. Canadians often define themselves, as I'm doing, in opposition to other cultures, mostly America, but also the United Kingdom. Less so now, right? There was a time when that was much more pronounced. So that it's a weird identity that exists in only in reaction to another identity, especially given how little Americans think about Canadians. It is very weird how much Canadians think about Americans. There's a kind of asymmetry there where we are often wondering what Americans are thinking about us, and what Americans are thinking about us is precisely nothing a lot of the time. um, the I wonder what else to say about
How
being
does that
Canadian.
play out in science fiction? Do you think there is
Say
a,
again?
how does it play
Oh
out?
yeah.
Is there a thing we can call Canadian science?
Yeah. So one of the things about being on the periphery of a powerful group, right? Being a smaller kind of outsider group on the periphery of a larger, glamorous, powerful group, is that you often have the insight of the kid who stands on the side of the playground watching the dynamics, but not part of them. I think this is why so many Canadians are great American comedians, because no one is capable of spotting the absurdities of the way that Americans interact with each other as Canadians who study it so avidly. There's a joke that it takes two Torontonians to change a light bulb, one to change the bulb and one to go to New York and make sure light bulbs are still cool. And so Canadians often come up with these insights. You look at Dan Aykroyd. I just read a great book that's a surprisingly interesting history of the Blues Brothers. And Dan Aykroyd's relationship to Americanness, I think, is a really good example of the way that Canadians understand Americans, because Elwood Blues is the most American character on the screen who's not a super patriot, right? Who's not just like some conservative kind of rhamboid figure. And that is a a caricature or an avatar of Americanness that only someone on the periphery could come up with, because everyone else is too saturated with Americanness to find its essence. And I think that this anthropological view of how things are and how contingent things can be, because you have these two countries that have so many similarities and yet their outcomes are so different, that on the one hand you have Canadians who write about alienness in a way that may be a little more convincing than Americans, right? I think Americans suffer from having so little experience of another culture uh, on their doorstep that they pay attention to. To the extent that they notice it, it's either in a kind of sentimental way, expressed in souvenir stand trinkets, or in this, like, as we see recently, this vicious xenophobic way that you get with Latin American, Central American culture, but not this kind of intense scrutiny that Canadians subject Americans to. And so there's a kind of anthropological bent maybe to Canadian science fiction sometimes when it describes alien cultures. And then the other thing is that, I think at its best, one of the things science fiction can do is interrogate the contingency of our technological relationships, right? That we're not just imagining a gadget, we're asking what if the gadget did stuff for different people, like not what the gadget does, but who it does it for and who it does it to. What if we used it in a different way? And there's so much about the way that our cultures operate across this, invisible imaginary line that shows you that what can feel like inevitability, just take the gun, right? The gun is this inevitable piece of technology ingrained in a culture. And like the imaginary line is not why Canadians don't have a ton of handguns. I mean, there's gun violence in Canada. And there's more of it now than there used to be, but it doesn't come close. And I live in as I say, in Burbank. Burbank is the city in Los Angeles County with the loosest gun store licensing. So we have more gun stores per capita than any other city in America, and we are where Los Angeles County comes to buy its guns. We don't own a lot of guns, but we have a lot of gun stores. And during lockdown, we would go for these incredibly long walks, just like everybody else. And we'd inevitably walk past a gun store, and it would be queued up not around one block, but around 2 blocks for people waiting to buy handguns. And I would always joke, those people must be the world's greatest marksmen if they're going to shoot the virus out of the air. But like Americans barely noticed. Like my neighbors barely noticed that this was happening. And so I think that when you interrogate or when you imagine a different way of using the technology we have, of not using it, of arranging it in different ways and so on, you kind of get past this like Thatcherite, there is no alternative hegemonic way of using technology, and into this great cyberpunk, the street finds its own use for things. Maybe it's not a coincidence that Bill Gibson is an adopted Canadian and that he came up with that motto, because in Canada, you are surrounded by people using technology in slightly different ways or grossly different ways than the culture just a few kilometers to the south, since 80% of Canadians live within 70 kilometers of the US border.
That's fascinating. And we're almost out of time. When we first opened up this, I noticed how interesting your shelves were. So I wondered if you could
Yeah.
give a quick tour guide to your shelves. What's
Oh
on
God.
there?
Well,
What's
like
your
there's a
shelf?
reason my domain is craphound.com. I am an inveterate physical culture collector. And so I have the inevitable, like, just books I've read, right? Which I think we all have. I have my collection of conference badges. I call that the I'm changing the climate, ask me how shelf. Let me see, what else do I have back there. So the black strip hanging
Just the
there,
conference
that's
badges.
say again?
I've
Yeah.
just registered the conference badges. You have your own
Yeah.
Christmas tree.
I,
Done.
I do. The Merrill collection will take your conference badges as a donation.
I
So
know
if you
that.
have a giant forest of conference badges, you know where to give them. The HackerCon badges are the best ones because they're all electronic and they have things like Game Boy emulators built into them and stuff. So this black strip, that is a piece of hand punched punch tape that Tom Jennings made. He created FidoNet, which was the thing that joined up all the BBSs. He designed or did the reverse engineering on the Phoenix ROM, which was the ROM that Gateway, Dell, and all the other PC companies used that cloned the PC ROM. And he founded a seminal gay rights zine called HomoCore during the Reagan years and the AIDS crisis. He lives nearby, but I first met him at a secret computing workshop where he brought a refurbished teletype machine and a roll of black hand punched tape with a biography of Alan Turing on it. And the teletype machine had all the literal bells and whistles and lights. And he ran the biography off this teletype machine. It took 3 days with the bells and the whistles going off. And he did not fit the reel to reel punch tape machine with a take up reel. And so part of the art was that this mountain of black tape piled up at the foot of the machine over 3 days and eventually swallowed the machine as this fanful paper rolled off the anyway. So that's part of a diagram of a Turing machine
That's
in Tom Jennings hand punch tape. What else do I have? I have some mammoth bones, an exploded Canon camera that's been carefully arrayed on armatures. Up on the top, you can see, oh, maybe you can't see that high. Let's see, what else have we got? A bug made out of old microcontrollers, sampler with some joke basic code. Can you see that top? No, you can't see that top shelf. There's a lot. I mean, I don't know if this will work. Let's see.
Yes, that's working. Let's take it a little slower. So brilliant. We get the entire panorama.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
It's funny because friends who were at my office in London, I had a couple of offices in London or my office in San Francisco before that, come in and they're like, oh, it looks just like your other offices. I'm
Of
like,
course.
yeah, that's what it looks like. All right.
Your home.
This is the like Gumi no Sensi Doctorovian cyberpunk aesthetic. They all look like this. This is like when I when they build a memorial to me, it should look like that. It should be like all cast in marble and look like this.
On that note, I
Yeah,
think we will conclude because I love that idea. I have actually
thank
recently
you.
seen
Although
artists
I realize you can't cast things in marble. It should be carved in marble.
carved in marble.
Or
Oh,
cast in aluminum, maybe.
but I have actually
Or
seen an artist's art room recreated, and we could do something like that for you.
there we go. Like Walt Disney's office has been
Yeah.
recreated like a pharaoh's tomb
So was
at Disney
Darwin.
World.
Darwin's study
Mm,
is something you can go see, and I've always thought that
very
was
nice.
fantastic. So on that
Is Francis Galton in the corner with a set of calipers to measure your skull?
absolutely. I think I will say thank you, and I'm
All
going to
right.
stop the recording.
Thanks, Farah. All
Thank you.
right.